We've had just released and a news conference on this Defence Strategic Review. There are significant changes that will be made, and it's all about reassessing, first of all, the risk assessment in Australia, the fact there's no longer this 10-year horizon, but the threats are here now, and how we're prepared to do so. Joining me live is former Chief Intelligence Staff Officer and Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, John Blaxland, and Senior News Corp correspondent Charles Miranda as well. Thanks both for your time. Look, I don't think huge shocks necessarily. What did you take out of this though? 62 recommendations, they're all accepted, some of them in principle, which is always a sort of wording we should note in all of this, but it's a change, isn't it? The risk is no longer on the horizon, it's here now, and a lot of it is us being able to be more self-sufficient, right? Even around making munitions and missiles here, being able to protect Australia's shores better as a result.
I certainly think it is a definitive step change, and while the report is quite light on, this is the declassified version for the public. So you'd have to imagine there's a lot more meat on the bone than what we've been presented. But there's clearly a step change in our complete thinking, the complete overhaul of the mission brief for the ADF and how they should operate, and also some of the hardware that we know about that is coming. The long range. It's all about long range, and it's also about a deterrence more than defending Australia. It's now deterrence from
the cost
Australia.
Of any potential, not just invasion, but blockade, whatever it might be. The cost of that we want to make more significant, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that comes, you can't just do that in isolation. You can't introduce all these great U-boot long-range pieces of kit, and we're talking about submarines and drones and the like, without having that whole of mentality overhaul. So the rhetoric's clear. Is the substance there to back it up, John?
So I think there's a little bit of a dissonance involved. There is... The rhetoric is constructive, it's logical. In my view, it's quite compelling. But then there's no real significant surge in terms of resourcing, in terms of additional recruitment, additional personnel. There's a rejigging. We've got programs actually cut from the program. You would have thought you would have been accelerating programs rather than removing programs. This, I think, speaks to a political disconnect in the Labor Party, I suspect, in reflection from the blowback from the Keating remarks of a couple of weeks ago, and I think he spooked the left of the Labor Party.
Okay. Is there not a need, though, for defence not to be sort of unlimited? I mean, one of the biggest and clearest reductions, infantry fighting vehicles, aren't we just sort of saying that's not what's needed anymore? And they might be great in the region, but it's not so much as a deterrence. They're almost become like a peacekeeping vehicle, even though they're not supposed to be, or a donations vehicle.
So there's an interesting, we've gone from, in the rhetoric in the paper talks about shifting from a balanced force to a focused force, and that is focused on scenarios in the region. The problem is that scenarios in the region, if you situate your appreciation, if you structure a force for a certain possibility, you then leave yourself vulnerable to scenarios that you haven't planned for. And that was the whole idea of the balanced force. The balanced force actually gave you a suite of options that you could respond to. Now, it is a significant step up, there's no question. Greater range, greater lethality, greater precision, greater resilience in terms of down the path, in terms of guided weapons, explosive ordnance and precision munitions. That's all very positive. So I don't wish to be overly critical. It is a positive document,
okay,
but it manifests a political constraint for the Labor Party at the moment.
The natural disasters element to this, it says they only, call on the army as a genuine last resort. Sounds fine, but when's the first time a Prime Minister's going to say, sorry, the army's doing an exercise somewhere, there's too many people taking leave, whatever it might be? Because it seems to me, political leaders, the best way to sort of show we're serious about a disaster is they call in the army, and they've got specialist capability like helicopter rescues other organisations don't. So don't you need an alternative? If the army's truly to become last resort, which it's not at the moment?
100%, and I think John and you and I have spoken about this many times in the past. I think one of the key things is if there's a genuine rescue that is required and the ADF have the greater resources, then of course they would step in. But I think there's no greater example on the waste of use of our highly trained, highly skilled troops than during COVID-19, when they were effectively guarding hotels. Now, I think states have to step up here. It was all well and good for the states to throw their hands up in the air during COVID-19 and say, oh, well, this is a Commonwealth responsibility. No, they have to take some of this responsibility, and they perhaps need some form of resilience policy or force to combat, in the first instance, some of these crises. Then perhaps, if it does require heavy assets such as Black Hawk rescues or we saw the ships involved in the fires in Victoria particularly involved, then so be it.
Yeah, and I guess not only can it be last resort, but there might be some sort of Commonwealth state combined organisation, call it whatever you will, that does deal with national disasters, because it seems to be the era we're in. And, we're never going to have each state be able to just get some helicopter rescues going off rooftops, right? But maybe combined, there's something that can be sort of permanently on call. It's a big country, a lot of different disasters are happening across the joint.
So we have Emergency Management Australia, which sits in the Home Affairs portfolio. It's got a remit to do this, but it's constrained because of where it sits. And the paper talks about whole of government, whole of nation responses, but it doesn't go into detail about how you coordinate a federal government, that's coordinating interdepartmentally with Defence, Home Affairs, Prime Minister and Cabinet, Finance, Treasury, etc. You've got also state and territory governments as well as local governments. They've all got their own little political interests and their own stakes in the equation. And as Charles points out, they have, constitutionally mandated responsibilities for first response to emergencies. The problem is we've got a boutique defence force that is way smaller than most people appreciate. They have no idea. Compared to, just by way of contrast, in January 1943, out of a population of 7.5 million people, we had an army of 14 divisions. There's about 10,000 troops in a division. Today we have about 1.5, out of 26 million. We are asking that defence force to do everything. It's the first responder, and it's partly because our SES, our Rural Fire Service, our state police, all of these kind of state responsibility first responder capabilities, they're either voluntary or they're under-resourced or they're not coordinated. And of course the other thing is the federal government wants to be seen to be doing something, and what do? You put an ADF uniform in to be seen to be doing something.
And recruitment's a massive failure in this country. We know that with the ADF.
And that gets to the whole issue of us needing, I think, an Australian universal scheme for national and community service. And we don't go there. We talk about maybe a ready reserve type scheme.
Well, there's a review of the reserves, right?
There is a reserve, but it's more than the reserves. If it's just the reserves, we're then missing the point. The problem is, you talk to Secretary of Defence and the CDF, they have a defence remit only. But the challenge is bigger. It's home affairs, it's external affairs, it's external measures, and it's state and territory matters. So this actually requires a prime ministerial-led initiative for national resilience, for fires, emergencies, floods, as well as things in the region. And of course, the challenges in terms of great power contestation as well beyond that.
And in the region matters, and our presence there, because we want to remain a good partner and one that can help out. And it's not just about defence, it might be national disasters. So how does that sort of fit in, I suppose? Maybe that body can be one and the same. You mentioned some of the detail, I guess, a bit lacking. What about the longer range strike and munitions aspect? Because we heard Pat Conroy talk about locally manufactured. And this is the important part about sovereignty. When you look at, it's not just being able to buy things, being able to make them as well. Otherwise, do you really have sovereignty? Did we find out much about that, or is a bit of detail to come on that?
What we did find out about is, and the report makes many references to the fact that our trade routes could easily be switched off. And, China is mentioned several times within the declassified version. You can only imagine how many times they're mentioned in the classified version. But without a doubt, the risk or the threat is there for China to cut off our trade routes, our sea routes, and all of a sudden, what are we left with? Well, we know we're a trade-based nation, so all of a sudden we're stuck. Sovereign capability in this country has been lacking for many, many years. And yes, they're saying we need to manufacture not just our own goods, but specifically our own military goods, our own missiles, our own guided missiles. We can't rely always on the Americans providing those to us.
Yeah, and that normally means they're more expensive, right?
That's right.
Just the reality of a smaller industry or whatever it would be in Australia. You don't have the scale. It's going to be more expensive. But it's jobs, it's innovation, and what this report also stressed is getting things online quicker, because it is defence is such a global race. If you're slow to do things, or you just get it once your partner, like the Americas, perfected it and they've got enough left over, you're perennially behind.
Well, this is what the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, is that the stocks of these type of high-tech equipment are actually in short supply.
Or even low-tech in Ukraine.
Yeah, relatively
basic
low.
munitions.
Yeah, basic munitions as well. And that's because for generations now we have not been thinking about the fact that we might actually face a serious conflict. It's been, we've been living in the post-Cold War years, the unipolar moment. We really have had a boutique defence force that was meant to make niche contributions to wars far away, not actually existential challenges to Australia and its interests closer to home. That actually needs a rethink, and this National Defence Strategic Review goes quite a long way to actually help Australia reposition, reimagine the environment we face, the challenges we face, and recognise that the good old days of globalisation, where you had just-in-time supply with everybody contributing from around the world, we now have to go to just-in-case. And that's a completely philosophically different mindset.
And again, a more expensive one as well.
Absolutely.
The just-in-case versus just-in-time. John spoke about the much smaller force we have now. Look, we're not going back to the proportions we had before, but it's an interesting question to approach. How many people out there are willing to join the army at current conditions and pay rates? And when it feels more like something serious might happen, that we'll be called on to go to overseas, that would be less like a sort of, let's just join with the US as to make sure, that they feel supported in a Middle Eastern war, for example, versus a really who wins this conflict type style in Taiwan, which would be, I'm sure it would feel like I'm not sort of downplaying the risk that troops were going to in Afghanistan and Iraq, but compared to that, Taiwan could look very different.
Absolutely, and I think anything that Australia goes into will be in the first instance a maritime contest that will be required. So it's certainly going to be leaning more heavily than in the other services with the Navy. But this is all about an integrated force anyway, so everyone's going to be involved. I think one of the greatest challenges the ADF has is recruitment. They can't recruit enough. They've got to recruit 20,000 more troops, more than we've ever had since the Vietnam War, up to 80,000 personnel altogether, and they simply are not competitive in the labour market. And also the fact that it takes, and this sounds ludicrous, I had to double check it, I didn't believe it, it takes up to 300 days just to recruit a single person.
Yeah.
300 days. I mean, if you and I were looking for another job, we'd be there within 3 weeks perhaps.
Yeah, look, the recruiting system is seriously broken at the moment. We've got a pipeline with significant disconnects between the recruiters and then the schools. They need to coordinate much more effectively what's going on. We get people who are recruited, then they're put through into a holding pattern. It's really problematic, significant reforms. Can I just make another point? It's really important. We need to think beyond Taiwan. My colleague Brendan Taylor talked about 4 flashpoints, and it's really important. We need to remember there's North Korea, there's the East China Sea, the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, there's Taiwan, but there's also the South China Sea, and God help us, there's also the risk of challenges in the Pacific, and the Solomon Islands is the tip of the iceberg. But we're playing, I think, not a game of chess and not the strategies of Clausewitz. We're playing a game of Go, which is a very different kettle of fish, and we're playing Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist. And I think we need to think, and it's simple oversimplification in one sense, but it's important to get our heads around the fact that China is not going to go to war. It's going to try and induce a capitulation. And this is what's happening in a number of fronts. We're looking at the problem through kinetic means, and that China is developing, at an industrial pace, its military capabilities, but it's doing to out-psych us. And I think that's really important for us to think about.
And foreign interference, we know already exists. It's already happening.
I've got to leave it there. I could talk all day, but you've got another commitment, John. So I'm only wrapping you so you're on time, just so you know.
Thank you.
John, Charles, thank you.